Hello, this is the Dreadweaver. Prepare yourself for an evening of horrifying tales that will weave webs of terror in the darkest corners of your mind. If you're a fan of stories of mystery, true crime, paranormal, or anything that crawls in the shadows just beyond our sight, you've found the right place. This week, one of our stories is a nightmare, literally. A terrifying dream crafted into a tale of terror for your listening pleasure. Let us know in the comments if you can pinpoint which story it is. If you like what you hear, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to turn on notifications. All of these actions tell YouTube you want to hear more from us. And with that, let us delve into the darkness. Story 1. The Pale Creature by Fishy Coin Fountain 311. I have only told a handful of people about this encounter, although it occurred about 16 years ago. Up until 5 years ago, I kept quiet about it because I was truly in denial about what I saw, and I was very scared that if I admitted that what I saw was real, I would see it one day again. This happened sometime in 2008, which made me 7 years old. My parents bought this farmhouse with a lot of acreage. On the property, there was a barn, forested area, and a pond. The reason why my parents decided to buy that house was because my dad was someone who loved working on projects and taking care of the property, and he eventually wanted farm animals. At the same time, my parents were wanting a lot of land to eventually build a new family home for me, female and 7, and my brother, male and 4, to grow up in, even though there was already a house, which is the one we lived in, there on the property. The house we lived in was a 2-bedroom, 1-story home. I would say it was less than 1,000 square feet in total. Prior to the experience I had in that house, there was absolutely nothing that I remembered which indicated there was something going on in the house that was paranormal. I was at the sink brushing my teeth with my dad, who was also in the bathroom at the same time. Still brushing my teeth, I turned around to face the bedroom, which was visible from the sink I was standing at. At that moment, I turned around to see this pale white humanoid creature crawling on all fours, crossing from the area around the fireplace and disappearing behind the end of the bed. When it crossed, it didn't move slowly, it went pretty quickly. When it moved, it never looked at me, so I wasn't able to see its face. Being a kid, I honestly thought it was my brother at first, who was 4 years old at this time, and he was just trying to be funny. So I was laughing as I walked out of the bathroom and went over to the end of the bed and said my brother's name, expecting to find him there as I turned the corner. I was shocked as there was nothing there at all. I even remember the feeling of my smile dropping, fully expecting to see my brother, but being greeted by nothing. I then looked underneath the bed, and there was nothing there either. I didn't mention seeing anything to my dad or mom, but I confirmed that my brother was sleeping in the other bedroom. I never saw that thing again. I still don't know what I saw, but it continues to freak me out just thinking about it. Please let me know your thoughts on this story, and if you have any questions, I'm open to answering them. I really appreciate you all reading. Story 2. Strange Things Heard by No College 6295. I used to live in the Brown Summit area, Guilford County, in the state of North Carolina. I am a male, currently in my 20s, and was 17 at the time this occurred. I lived in a rather nice neighborhood, with my stepmother and father, my mother living outside of Reedsville. I would usually move back and forth, staying with my mother during the week, and my father on the weekend. For the most part, both areas were pretty quiet, maybe even boring to me at the time. One thing I did find pleasant to do was to explore the large mass of land my stepmother owned. Unfortunately, I'm not sure how many acres it was, but it was fairly big, and it stretched into the main forest and even to a railroad track, which of course my father made trails in. Anyways, I had always made my way through these trails every time I came for the weekend, sometimes even bringing my dog, whose name was Buddy, with me. I would spend a large amount of time out there, usually on foot, since my father didn't trust me alone on the 4x4 we had. Just as any other day, I decided to take a walk down the trail, this time alone, since Buddy had to be groomed and washed at the time. It was around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, if I remember correctly. It had also recently just rained, so the walk was a little muddy, and there was a recent lodging in the main entrance to the trails. I had spent a couple hours out there, even sitting down on logs or the ground itself sometimes during the walk. Before I knew it, I had found myself on the main trail. It was a dirt road, going down a narrow way, with the forest on both sides. In the middle were rows of power lines. The dirt road was fairly uneven, with holes, trenches, etc. I believe it was somewhere around 6, and the sun had started to set, giving off that yellowish-orangish look to the trail. Then the first thing came to be. Suddenly, as I took a moment to stop and take a glance around, already sweating due to it being summer at the time, and walking in the heat was prone to do that to you, I noticed that everything was quiet. Usually I didn't care to look into such things, like the birds chirping, but the sudden quiet caused me to freeze, to listen. Everything felt very still, like the forest was hiding. That's when I heard a loud shrill, or a shriek. To my guess, it was probably a few yards away, maybe more, somewhere in the woods, I assumed. It sounded like a mix between a dying horse and a man yelling. I know how that must sound, but my guess is as good as yours anyway. After the scream, there were a series of snorts, around 3 or 4 of them. And as you could guess, I was dumbfounded. I've heard strange things before, but I knew what they were, like foxes yelling. But this was obviously different. It didn't even sound like an animal to me. But of course, I wasn't really thinking about this at the time. I just turned around and ran. Pure adrenaline basically turned me into a well-trained track athlete, and I ran non-stop for probably a few miles before I slipped somewhere near the lodging. I fell and got cramped up and covered in mud. The adrenaline had finally worn off. I limped the rest of the way back, and I never uttered it to anyone, not even my own father, until now, to a bunch of strangers on Reddit. From time to time, I still think about it, a random thought in my head if I'm on the bus or something like that. But to this day, I still haven't decided what it could have possibly been. My current theory being it was just some random hurt animal, probably caught in a trap of some kind. But then again, who knows? Story 3. My Friend Threatened to Kill Me by Bike OK 4256. I've never had too many experiences I could deem creepy in my life. Honestly, I live a pretty mundane but fun life. However, I had an experience with an old acquaintance from school that kept me pretty paranoid for a good bit of my childhood years. I won't give anyone the real names of these people, so I'll just call the girl in this story Jess. For a while during my school years, starting in elementary up to middle school, I went to school with Jess. I wasn't friends with her, but I knew her and I wouldn't turn down any time to talk with her. She was always very odd in the way she presented herself. She was always dainty and sort of kept to herself. It may be odd to say, but she had an almost ethereal vibe to her. Blue eyes, complete albino white hair, and was always soft-spoken. Very princess-like. Anyway, I always occasionally approached her, but nothing much else for a good while. You know, the usual early childhood school acquaintance sort of dynamic. One day, I was at our local park during the weekend when she and her little brother came to the park. It was a bit of a surprise, but a welcome one. I played the usual park games with them, caught up, and in general just had a good time. Eventually, we ended up playing hide and seek. I was the seeker, if I remember well. I found her little brother, and we eventually found her at the top of the slide. Our town's park used to have a giant frog slide, where you could sit on a platform on the top and go down 3 different slides. We found her, and as she ran up the ladder when we caught her going down the other end, her tone shifted. Like, completely shifted. She had an unnerving, stern expression, a stark contrast to how she was acting before. She then, without warning, said, "I'm going to kill you," to me. Seeing her have this sudden change and verbal threat toward me genuinely scared me and made me feel like I did something horribly wrong. I ran to hide somewhere in the park for what felt like half an hour. Soon enough, she eventually confronted me and came clean. She apologized and revealed to me what she had apparently been keeping from me. She revealed to me that she was actually a vampire. No, I'm not making this up. She told me straight up that she was actually a vampire and was keeping it a secret from everyone to not reveal the truth. This is where I need to bring up a crucial detail about this girl. For all of my time knowing her, she genuinely and wholeheartedly believed she was a vampire. To this day, I don't believe this was some sort of screwing with people for shits and giggles. She genuinely believed it, eventually told the truth to one of my close friends, went into disturbing detail about what she did during the night, and constantly made sure I didn't tell anyone. The reason I say that is at the park, on that playset that evening, she told me straight to my face that with her powers, she could see what I was doing 24/7, and if I told anyone, like friends, teachers, or even my own parents, that she'd come to my house in the middle of the night and kill me. I know this sounds really stupid, but to me, as a really gullible young kid, I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't, so as far as I knew, she was genuinely threatening me. I left that park with the knowledge of this idea she set into my head, and it genuinely affected me. I kept the secret for years, even after she left the school. I was genuinely torn with my decision multiple times in my life, fighting between telling my mom and not telling my mom, since I felt so horrified about what she might do to me either way. Eventually, years later, I came to learn that it wasn't real, obviously, but the years I lived with that paranoia in the back of my mind can't be taken back. Even my current friend group agrees about how odd of an individual she was and how off-putting she felt. I know how stupid I seemed back then for genuinely believing it, but honestly, I reacted in the most realistic way I could. It may have been complete BS, but the idea of someone threatening you to come to your house and kill you in your sleep isn't normal. Wherever she is, I hope Jess is doing well, and I hope she eventually grew out of this phase she seemed to be in for a good while. Story 4. My Premonition Saved Mine and My Siblings' Lives, by Divinity369. This happened when I was about 8 to 9 years old. My family moved to a new townhome in Utah for my dad's new job. I had 3 younger siblings, and we were all very close growing up. It was wintertime, and all of us siblings had been playing outside in the snow in the backyard for hours. Finally, in addition to the cold becoming too much, our mom coaxed us indoors with some hot chocolate. After drinking the hot chocolate, we huddled together in front of the fireplace to warm up. For reference, the townhome we were living in at the time was new, which means we were the first to live in it. Therefore, all the appliances, including the fireplace, were brand new. Being the eldest sibling, I was a proficient reader and enjoyed reading books out loud to my siblings. I remember we were all gathered together, with me reading a book, and we were maybe only 2 feet away from the fireplace, with all of us kids sprawled out on the carpet, sitting directly in front of it for heat. What happened next is difficult to express in words, but I'll do my best. As I was reading the book, it was as if there was a part of my awareness that split off from what I was doing at that moment, and it was almost as if I was having an out-of-body experience, even though I was still very aware of reading the book out loud to my siblings. I was instantly being shown a very vivid, visceral scene of the exact fireplace we were all sitting in front of. In this vision, the fireplace glass exploded suddenly, without warning, and spewed molten pieces of glass all over where we were sitting, and the carpet underneath us became burned and melted from the hot glass pieces. I heard a voice very clearly tell me in that moment, "Stop reading right now and quickly move all of your siblings as far away as you can from the fireplace." I set down the book and jumped to action, making sure to get my bewildered siblings moved to the far back of the living room, behind the couch, as this provided a physical barrier between us and the fireplace. As soon as I got us all to the back of the living room, sure enough, we heard a loud crack and then a pop. When we looked around the couch at the fireplace, the protective sheet of glass on the outside of the fireplace had gotten too hot, apparently, and the pressure of the heat from the fire caused the glass to crack into many smaller pieces and then spew out with force all over the carpet, right where all of us had been laying. Just like in my vision, the carpet we had been sitting on only seconds prior was burned and melted with chunks of hot glass all over. The sound of the glass cracking and popping was loud enough to catch my mom's attention, who was in the kitchen down the hallway. She ran into the room, confused over the noise, until she saw the glass laying all over the floor. She and my dad were amazed when I told them the story of what happened, and they are still bewildered to this day as to how or why that fireplace exploded like that, since everything in that house was brand new. My guardian angels were looking out that day, that's for sure. Story 5. Entities from My Youth by Live Painting 3221. The first paranormal experiences I can remember were inside my great-grandparents' house. After my great-grandfather passed away, I would stay with my great-grandmother often. She lived completely alone. We would hear knocks on the doors and walls late at night, footsteps and whispering, pots and pans clanging. I was only 4 or 5 at this point. She assured me that it was just my grandpa and to not be scared. She would even sometimes talk to him in a jestful manner. I didn't fully understand because I was so young. She passed away a year later. We moved into the house after that. I was around 8 years old and in the 3rd grade. The house was built in the 1930s and was only 2 bedrooms originally. I had 1 room to myself. My little brother and sister, who are twins, had the other room. They were barely a year old, still in their cribs. My mom and her husband slept on a hideaway bed that folded out from the couch. My bedroom faced the living room where they slept. My door faced out where the couch was, so I could see them sleeping while laying in my bed at night. I had a large chifforobe closet in my room and a metal bed frame. The first week we moved in, I began to experience things. I would be awoken by noise and see a shadow moving around in the living room. I would get scared and cover my head up and try to go back to sleep. I would hear something in the chifforobe closet regularly. One night, I was awoken by bright lights. Lights so bright, my first thought was someone is parked in a car in front of my window. That's impossible. One night, I saw a figure, best described as the opposite of a shadow person, like it was bathed in light, standing over my mother. Some nights, I would hear scratching or tapping on my window. One night, my metal bed frame started shaking ever so slowly, then a little bit faster and more erratically, like some faint type of force was just shaking it randomly. Shortly after that, I had my first experience with sleep paralysis. I told my mother about it the next day, and she admitted to having the same experience. She described it as a shadow man with a hood over his head, holding her down and sucking the energy out of her. We even made up a name for him, Hoodie. This was in 1997, and we didn't have the internet, so we had no idea this kind of thing was common. I was terrified. I had to start sedating myself to be able to sleep, and still sometimes wouldn't fall asleep until the sun came up. Around 7th or 8th grade, I moved into one of the newly built bedrooms. The way it was laid out, I had to walk through my little sister's room to get to my room. She was around 5 or 6 years old at the time. She would have full-blown conversations with an old antique doll. The doll was actually handed down to her from my mother. It was a 1970s Mrs. Beasley doll. The voice hadn't worked in years. The pull string to make the doll talk was actually ripped off, but this didn't stop her from talking. I was so scared of that doll, I would hide it from my sister. I would bury it in the bottom of her giant toy box. She would always turn up somewhere else, though. One night, I went to the bathroom, and when I opened my sister's door to walk back to my room, the doll was standing there in front of her bed. Just standing there, straight up, for a few seconds before she fell over. The doll's feet are soft, and there's no way it could stand. I screamed so loud I woke my little sister. My mom got rid of that doll the next day. Story 6. Was this a demonic encounter? When I was 4 years old, my mom, aunt, and grandpa left to go help with disaster relief after Hurricane Katrina, since my grandpa grew up in Louisiana and very much still considered it a massive part of who he was. I ended up living with my older cousin, younger brother, and grandma for a few weeks or longer since we didn't know when they would be back. One night, I woke up in my grandpa's recliner in the living room, since it was where I usually slept, and I remember seeing the TV was on either Boomerang or Cartoon Network. I remember hearing what sounded like noises coming from the hallway where the front door was, and looking to see what it was, and seeing some shadowy figure walking down the hallway. I just got up, ran up to it thinking it was my mom, and stopped maybe 2 feet away because I felt instant dread. I thought it was my mom, but it felt like something inside of me was telling me that it wasn't my mom. I just remember it looking down at me, and me looking back into the weird, inky, swirling void that was its face before it said, "Hello." I just immediately burst into tears, ran back to the recliner, and just hid under the blanket I had and closed my eyes. Then I remember waking up to what sounded like tapping on the entranceway that led into the living room and seeing the same figure. I started begging and yelling at my cousin and brother who were sleeping on the couch to wake up, but they never did. My grandma didn't wake up either, no matter how hard I was screaming or how loud. Nobody was there to help me. Then I remember seeing what looked like children start peeking over the entranceway at all angles, sideways and upside down. I remember seeing maybe 20 of them around my age, of all skin tones and hair colors. Then the figure I saw earlier just said, "Hello again." And that was it for me. I just dove in between my cousin and brother, trying to hide in between them, and passed out. I woke up in between them that morning and told my grandma everything. I don't know how many pictures I drew, but each one just disturbed my grandma. I remember telling her just how scary the shadowy figure was, and how it wasn't a dream. The pictures she just threw away when I went to preschool that day, and wouldn't even let me talk about it. I remember telling my first grade school therapist about it, and drew the pictures again, and she just looked confused but terrified. I'm 23 now, and I still can't find answers. Thinking or even speaking about this event just terrifies me and makes me feel like something is near. The other day, I was talking to my boyfriend about it, and weird things around our apartment started happening for a solid few hours. Does anyone know what this could have been? Story 7. The Restoration. I was going through the motions that spring morning, drinking coffee and reading the news as I prepared for a new day. The news was slow that morning for a change. Lots of city council meeting briefs, business updates, and human interest stories. I scrolled through them, clicking on a few that seemed interesting. It was something to read at least. I skimmed through an article about upcoming development plans for our local downtown area. The city had approved an urban green space, and not for the first time. A few years prior, they had approved a similar plan, but funding fell through. This one seemed more promising, but only time would tell whether or not the project would come to fruition. I exited the article and continued scrolling. I made it a few articles down when something really caught my eye. One of the historic downtown buildings had recently been converted to an inn, complete with restored architectural details and historical art pieces. The owners offered spiritual retreats, and there was a heavy spiritual influence in the building's redesign. The article's cover photo was what caught my eye, a beautiful stained glass piece that had been installed at the top of the building, a triple moon with a gorgeous blend of colors. Best of all, the new owners were welcoming interested visitors for tours. I was intrigued and bookmarked the article. Something about the building seemed to call to me, and I couldn't wait to set foot inside. I finished scrolling through the day's news and put myself together for the day. It was time to get out and accomplish things. I had bills to pay, groceries to get, and a child to pick up from school. I first stopped off at the bank to cash a check. Leaving, I felt the urge to take the long route to the grocery store. I rounded the block to the right instead of the left as usual. I didn't take this route often, and was taking in my surroundings, looking for interesting places to visit over the summer with my daughter. I made it about a quarter of a mile down the street when I saw it. The triple moon stained glass. There it was. I glanced down at the clock on the dashboard. 12:05 p.m. I had about 3 hours before it was time to pick my daughter up from school. That was plenty of time to stop at the inn and take a quick tour, complete my shopping, and still be early for pickup. What luck! I practically leapt out of the car, dancing with glee as I set out on the small adventure. I didn't get many adventures anymore, so even the smallest of them ignited a huge joy within me. I walked inside the inn quietly. The space seemed sacred and deserving of quiet. The entryway was a narrow hallway with a larger room to the right and a staircase to the left at the end of the hall. There was a woman in the next room, dusting a shelf of trinkets. I walked softly toward her, not wanting to break the silence. I entered the room, and she looked up at me. "Hello," I said softly. "Oh, hello," she replied. "Are you here for the tour?" she asked, as she continued her cleaning duties. "Yes," I said. "I read an article about the inn this morning and just happened to be driving by. I'd love to check it out." "Well, you're in luck," she said. "Let me just put this away." She turned abruptly, knocking a glass sculpture off the shelf she had been tidying. She sighed a deep sigh. "Oh, no," I said. "Can I help you clean that up?" No, Claire," she called. A woman in a polo shirt and khakis walked in from an adjoining room. "Can you help me clean this up? I need to give a tour." Claire nodded silently and walked out of the room. She came back with a broom and started sweeping as the woman made her way toward me. "I hope that wasn't something special," I said apologetically, feeling as if I had somehow set off a chain of events that had resulted in the destruction of an irreplaceable artifact. "Oh, don't worry," she said. "All of our historical pieces are locked up tight. That shelf is reserved for vendors. They put a lot of work into their pieces, but at least they're still around to recreate their work." I nodded silently, still feeling that perhaps I had made a poor decision in deciding to come here. The woman led me toward the stairs. "We keep the good pieces up here," she said. My anticipation grew with every step we took toward the upper floor. The woodwork was beautiful and looked almost brand new. I imagined this was how the building must have looked in its original splendor when the founding residents of the city first climbed these same steps. We reached the landing at the top of the steps. There was a nook with a bench beneath a window, a few pillows, and some intricate carvings in the woodwork above it. The symbols seemed spiritual in nature, but I could not place where they had originated from. It was beautiful, but also filled me with a strange sort of dread that I did not understand. The woman walked past the nook and motioned for me to follow. We came to a door made of solid metal. It seemed out of place in contrast with the intricate details of the rest of the building, but made sense at the time due to the guarded nature of the priceless art. The woman produced a key, unlocked the door, and we entered another room. I walked forward, confused, as I entered a room that seemed unfinished. It had been stripped to the studs, with not so much as drywall gracing the walls. I turned around to ask the woman about the room, and watched as she locked the door behind us. Seeing the confusion in my face, she smiled faintly and said, "Standard procedure. Can't be leaving the art unsecured." Reassured, I nodded and followed as she moved through the unfinished room. We reached another door that opened into a narrow hall. I followed the woman to another door at the end of the hall. She opened the door to another set of stairs and slipped through a gap beneath them. I attempted to follow her, but the gap was so narrow it made me uncomfortable. This was my first inkling that something was wrong. I know, I probably should have noticed the minute we walked into that unfinished room, but I was busy giving the new business the benefit of the doubt. Why in the hell were we squeezing ourselves into hard-to-reach places to view some art? I didn't like this one bit. I'm sorry, but I just realized what time it is, and I have to get going so I don't miss school pickup, I called out to the woman. There was no response. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. "Hello?" I called again. I still didn't think anything truly sinister was happening. I just felt uncomfortable and was ready to be back in my own territory. Again, there was no response. I looked around at the empty walls. This upper stairwell was clearly not restored. The stairs were aged, some of them looked almost rotten, and it was a stark contrast to the splendor of the rest of the building. I suddenly felt the urge to flee. I turned and ran back the way we had come. I reached the first metal door, only to remember that the woman had locked it behind her. Shit. Where to now? I had to look for another exit. I turned to look toward the windows at my right, only to find that they were not windows as I had first thought. There were two doors that had originally opened up to some type of rooftop escape, but now held nothing beneath them. Still, they seemed to be the only way out. I ran toward them and began to pull on the handles in desperation. To my dismay, I found they were chained and locked. What the hell was I supposed to do now? It was nearly 1 o'clock. Plenty of time for running errands, but not so much when you're trying to escape a fortress. I looked around for a weapon, something to break the glass or maybe even pick the locks. I glanced around until my eyes landed on a small screwdriver, like the kind used for eyeglasses, lying on a bench in a dark corner of the room. I turned with purpose, but before I could run to it, a woman's voice yelled, "Stop!" I froze in sheer terror, thinking the woman had come back for me. I spun around to see a younger woman, who seemed to be in her early 20s, standing near the door to the stairwell. Her eyes were wide with terror, and blood was running down the right side of her face. "Don't waste your time here. There's no way out from this room," she warned. I stood there silently, shocked and not sure what to make of this woman's presence. Who was she? Where had she come from? Could she be trusted? She may have sensed my fear, because she pointed at the wound on her head and said softly, "She's after me, too." I looked her up and down for a moment, trying to assess whether or not she was a cleverly disguised threat. "I think I've found a way out, but we have to hurry. She'll be back any second." She motioned for me to follow her and started for the upper stairwell. I didn't think I could trust her. This seemed far too convenient a solution for my predicament. But unfortunately, I was out of options and there was no time to waste. I followed the young woman as quietly as I could, fear quaking through my body with every step. I hoped I was making the right decision. We silently slipped through the door to the stairwell. I was on high alert as I passed the gap beneath the stairs, daring to pause for a glance into the hall on the other side. I saw the distinctive dress shoes worn by the first woman closing in at an alarming rate, thundering with every step. A large metal object dragged along the floor beside her feet, what appeared to be a mallet of some kind, but I'd never seen one so large. I glanced up at the young woman with terror in my eyes. She grabbed my hand, putting a finger to her lips to silence me, and pulled me up the stairs. We reached the top landing, and I could hear the crazed woman yelling from the base of the steps. "I know you're up there!" she shouted. "You can't hide from me!" The young woman pulled me around the corner and again pressed her finger to her lips, reminding me that my silence could be our saving grace. Wordlessly, she pointed across the spacious landing to a simple wooden door. "Fire escape," she whispered, as quietly as she could manage. Just around the corner, I could hear the loud footsteps of the crazed woman, slowly making her way up every step, the mallet thudding beside her with every step she gained. The young woman counted to 3 on her fingers, and we made a break for it. That's when all hell broke loose. Our running had given away our position, and the crazed woman decided to capitalize on that moment. She must have been closer than I had imagined, because she was on us in an instant. The young woman reached the door and flung it open. "Run!" she screamed as she flew through the door. I glanced back to see that the crazed woman was right behind me with the mallet mid-swing. I sidestepped just in time to avoid being struck in the head, but not entirely evading her wrath. The mallet crashed into my shoulder, and the wave of pain that radiated through my body nearly sent me to my knees. I gasped, and as the rush of air entered my lungs, the adrenaline kicked in. Fighting waves of intense nausea, I flew out the door and into the narrow stairwell leading down the back of the building. The woman remained right behind me, a wildfire in her eyes, but somehow I managed to stay just out of the mallet's reach. The young woman was at the bottom of the stairwell, holding the outer door open. I flew out into the alley, screaming. I took one last look behind me, expecting the young woman to be following right behind. Instead, she stood motionless on the threshold, terror in her eyes. She mouthed goodbye, and then I watched her vanish into thin air. I slowed for a moment, confused and afraid for my companion, but I knew I couldn't stop. I followed the alley to the street, screaming for help. Like a light at the end of the tunnel, I was met by a group of people at the mouth of the alley who had stopped when they heard my pleas for help. As they pulled me to safety, I looked back one last time, expecting to see the woman still chasing me. There was no one there. The door I had escaped from was shut, and the woman was nowhere in sight. After my attack, police swarmed the inn, and what they found was unbelievably disturbing. The woman who had chased me was the inn's new owner. She was a historian and spiritualist who had spent years studying historical and defunct religions. Throughout her studies, she had come across an ancient religion that was virtually unheard of in the Western world. The more she studied, the more she became convinced that she was being called to revive the religion. The caveat? This religion practiced human sacrifice, and the woman became convinced that the religion could not be revived without it. Under the guise of a modern inn and spiritual retreat, the woman planned to lure trusting individuals into the maze of a building like a modern-day H.H. Holmes. Hence the reason why the outside and lower floor were decorated with recognizable and beautiful spiritual symbols, but the seemingly spiritual symbols on the upper floor seemed strange and unsettling. I was horrified when the police announced she had already had at least one victim, as they had discovered a body down the hall behind the gap under the stairs. It took weeks for the body to be identified. The victim turned out to be a 23-year-old woman from the next town over, an avid spiritualist who was looking forward to a quiet retreat. She was a young woman feeling lost in the turmoil of life, as many of us do at that age, and she was relying on the retreat to help her get centered and find a new path. When I saw her photo in the paper, all the breath left my body. It was the young woman who guided me to safety, the one who mysteriously disappeared as I made my escape. She had been killed 1 week prior to my visit. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head. Her name was Sarah. I'm still working to process the trauma that befell me that night, to sort out all of the confusing details of my attack. As if the violence weren't enough, I am constantly replaying my interactions with Sarah on that night. I had seen her clear as day, and despite the wound to her head, she had been very much alive. I hadn't trusted her, but felt I was out of options and chose to follow her lead. When she didn't follow me through the outside door, I had thought she was somehow part of the whole thing, and couldn't figure out why she would have helped me escape. But yet, the coroner's report plainly said that she had been deceased at least 7 days before I met her. I don't think I will ever find answers to the questions I still have, and running through these events over and over again will surely drive me mad. I do know one thing for certain, though. I will forever be grateful for Sarah's bravery that day, for giving me a second chance to appreciate the life I have, and to be here for my daughter as she grows up. And at the end of the day, that is all that truly matters. Thank you for joining me for this episode of The Dreadweaver. I'll be back next week with more terrifying true tales. If you would like to submit a story of your own, head to our subreddit r/thedreadweaver or send us an email at thedreadweaver@outlook.com. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share with your friends, and click the bell icon to turn on notifications if you want to hear more. Until our paths cross again in the shadows, stay vigilant and beware the whispers of the night. This is the Dreadweaver, signing off.